The member from Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question to the Premier. According to the public accounts, nearly $800 million in Hydro One cash was recognized by the Trillium Trust last year. These, quote, asset optimization proceeds were supposed to be spent on infrastructure last year. This was the whole point of the Hydro One sale. But none of this Hydro One cash was spent on infrastructure. Will the Premier explain where $800 million in Hydro One cash proceeds has gone instead of being spent on infrastructure?
Mr. Finance.
Mr. Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. The member opposite, I think, does know that all proceeds that are generated from Hydro One in regards to the IPO and since then the subsequent offering, a good portion of that has gone to pay down the debt that's accorded to the transaction, and the rest is going directly into the Trillium Trust, which is being used for infrastructure projects in our communities, Mr. Speaker, something that that member opposite hasn't had a plan to do, and they actually have not even called for investments in some of these infrastructure projects and transit systems that are critically important to our competitiveness and enabling us to have a higher return for the use of those funds, and that is all the reason that we're making these investments and the transition from Hydro One to be reinvested into our communities.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Well, you actually aren't investing the money in infrastructure. But another question. When the Premier gave the privatized Hydro One a $2.6 billion tax holiday, this increased the book value of the government's remaining ownership in Hydro One by about $2.4 billion. Last year, the government rewrote the Trillium Trust Act to allow the government to recognize this gain on paper as revenue that could somehow be dedicated to infrastructure. But this $2.4 billion is not cash. It exists only on paper. It cannot be spent on subways. Yet this accounting adjustment represents more than half of the $4 billion in Hydro One proceeds the Premier has promised for infrastructure. Will the Premier explain how $2.4 billion in accounting vapor is going to be used to pay for infrastructure?
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. This is not a tax holiday that's been attributed to this transaction. This is actually a normal course of business that's been made. The $2.8 billion deferred tax benefit actually does provide a net fiscal benefit to the province, all of which is being afforded right into the Trillium Trust, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, we have $3.4 billion thus far from the transactions that is paying down debt, and an additional $4.95 billion that's going to be going directly to the trust fund to enable us to do the very projects that the member opposite hasn't even planned for. We're making the plans, we're making the reinvestment.
I know you're tempted, but wrap up sentence, please.
They obviously don't like the fact that we're generating more funds, more money to be reinvested to make ourselves more competitive. Mr. Speaker, that's what this is all about.
New question.